Aldous Huxley, heir to the most refined English intellectual aristocracy, author of Brave New World, man whose preferred reading was, by his own confession, the Encyclopedia Britannica, once answered a literary survey by saying something about goodness as the foundation of poetry, and concluded that a criminal could not write a good poem. But there is a single name that demolishes this claim completely: François Villon. Villon, the vagrant, the swindler, the sacrilegious thief, the assassin, the condemned man, François Villon, whom many consider the greatest poet of the French language. The conclusion was irresistible. Huxley simply hadn't yet reached, in his reading of the Encyclopedia Britannica, the entry under Villon. Or alternatively, the Encyclopedia Britannica was irredeemably wrong. There was no other explanation. The story of François Villon begins, and in a sense never leaves, the gutters and the great squares of medieval Paris. He was born around 1431, possibly in Paris itself, certainly in poverty. He studied at the University of Paris, taking a bachelor's degree and then a master's, which means he was a cleric in the technical medieval sense, a man of the church's educational system, a man of Latin and scholastic philosophy and the whole elaborate machinery of medieval learning. And then, in 1455, he killed a priest in a street fight. He was pardoned. He joined a gang of thieves. He robbed the College of Navarre. He disappeared, appeared again, was imprisoned more than once, tortured, condemned to death, had his sentence commuted to banishment. And then, here is the question that has never been answered. He vanished. The records of his crime survive in extraordinary detail. The exact circumstances of the killing, the names of his accomplices, the amounts stolen, the judicial proceedings. But no record of his execution exists, nor any record of him after 1463. He walked into the historical dark, and the dark kept him. What he left behind was poetry, and the poetry was so perfectly made that it has never stopped resonating. To understand what Villon was and what he did, you have to understand the world he came from. He is called the last Goliard, the last in a long tradition of wandering scholars, the clerici vagantes, unruly university men who had been populating the roads of Europe since the 12th century, writing irreverent Latin verse about wine and women and the boredom of studying, parodying sacred hymns with blasphemy, asking for money from the rich with increasingly ingenious rhetoric, confessing their sins with a repentance that nobody, least of all themselves, took seriously. The Goliard was a social type as much as a literary type, a man educated beyond his station, disconnected from stable employment, making his way through a society that had no real place for him, expressing his displacement through poetry that combined enormous formal sophistication with deliberately low subject matter. The greatest of these medieval student poets, collectively, was a great poet, and their last individual representative, in the 15th century, in Paris, was François Villon. But Villon was also something more. He stood at a hinge point of history, at what one writer called the autumn of the Middle Ages, that strange and violent twilight in which all the traditional values had been overturned. The roads were full of vagrants. The great squares before the Gothic cathedrals swarmed with anonymous crowds shouting revolutionary furies and mystical anguishes. The 15th century was, in literary terms, the poorest of European centuries. And from those masses, one solitary man emerged. A man to whom, in the ancient phrase, a god gave the power to say what the other suffered. A man who transformed the inarticulate cry into musical order, into poetry. Villon. What he had to work with, thematically, was entirely conventional. The Blessed Virgin, women, pastoral life, death. These were the great commonplaces of medieval poetry, the expected furniture of any serious verse. What Villon did with them was not expected at all. As a condemned man who had nothing left to lose, he expressed those commonplaces differently, personally. À himself puit, qui meurt à ses lois de tout dire. He who is dying has the right to say everything. And he said everything. He composed a prayer for his elderly mother, a woman of simple faith who had never learned to read, who came to church to see the painted paradise and the harps and the painted hell where the damned are boiled. And that prayer, beginning Dame du Ciel, Regent Terrien, has the colors of the stained glass of the Sainte-Chapelle. It is one of the supreme expressions of the cult of the Madonna in all of French literature. But the woman Villon actually knew was the tavern girl, the prostitute, the creature of the brothels, tout aux taverns et aux filles. He had no illusions about the pastoral life that convention required him to praise, and when the genre demanded he celebrate the idyllic existence of the peasant content with simple pleasures, he responded with the brutal contradicts de Frank Gontier, asserting his actual philosophy. Il n'est trésor que de vivre à son aise. There is no treasure like living at one's ease. To that materialist ideal Villon had sacrificed everything, and obtained only the hard prison cell where he had nearly died and the prospect of the gallows. This is a man riding with a rope around his neck, metaphorically and at certain moments literally. And what he wrote, under that pressure, is among the most formally perfected verse in any language. The paradox has fascinated critics for centuries. The most disordered life produced the most ordered poetry. But when you think about it carefully, this is not a paradox at all. The form of his living and the form of his poetry are entirely congruent. Because to make that kind of poetry, to transform chaos into musical structure, to find in the apparent incoherence of a shattered life the secret arrangement that gives it meaning, required exactly the discipline that his life continuously and ostentatiously refused to exercise in any other domain. One definition of a poet's sincerity describes it as a tendency toward increased order. The poet's life may be chaos, but the poem imposes form on that chaos, and in the imposition of form, reveals something true. Villon's sincerity consisted in living his life intensely, in coherence with himself, and then transforming that coherence, criminal, dissolute, terrified, devout, irreverent, tender, into verse. The assassin could write an immortal poem. He did. The key to understanding how is the Grand Testament, the longer and greater of his two testaments, in which the apparent confusion of an inheritance document. Villon bequeathing his poverty, his filth, his infamy, his cries, his despairs, his prayers, in a few verses to various acquaintances, conceals a precise structure. The Grand Testament, apparently confusing, follows certain norms of the scholastic poetic art of his era to give a firm base to this great confession, this near diary of a dissolute life. The ballad interpolated into the Testaments resemble conclusions or organ points that resolve difficulties and dissolve dissonances. And the most famous of those interpolated ballades, the Ballade de Dames du Temps Jadis, the Ballad of the Ladies of Times Past, is in the precise analysis of the great stylistician Leo Spitzer, not the simple melancholy song it appears to be in all the anthologies that have torn it from its context, but something far more complex and carefully designed. Spitzer observed in the apparent disorder of the two testaments a secret order corresponding to certain rules of scholastic logic and musical composition of the era. The ballades function as conclusions, as organ points. The Ballad of the Ladies appears in the Grand Testament after stanzas 40 and 41, which are a description of all the horrors of death, the Hippocratic face, the cold sweat, the nauseating expectoration, described with the cruelest naturalism, like the penitential sermons of the medieval friars. And the ballad that follows, the transformation of a medieval student's song, Ubi sunt animos in mundo fuer, is a dispute about life and death, a poetic imitation of the scholastic disputations. It has the intentionality of the poet. Villon employs, deliberately and surprisingly, archaic forms of language. The word entendre, instead of the more current années passées, was already archaic in his own time. He imitates, in the musical sense, the way the ingenious musicians of his era composed in canon. The names of the famous ladies appear successively according to certain rules of university disputation, governed like a leitmotif by the famous pair Paris and Helen, who had already appeared in stanza 40 of the Grand Testament, and whose vowels and rhymes supply the entire phonetic apparatus of the ballade, only to dissolve finally in the music of the refrain. Mais au sont les neiges d'antan, but were the snows of yesteryear. Thus the terrors of death resolve themselves in the secret coincidence of human destiny with the destiny of nature, an idea entirely alien to the medieval spirit, announcing the sensibility of a new age. And the question, Dix moi ou, and in quel pays? Where did they go, the famous beautiful ladies of every era? En the melancolie interrogative en serre, mais où sont les neiges d'antan? Wander misunderstood through all the anthologies. Because in the context of that poetry, the refrain is not a sigh of resignation. It is what Spitzer called a secret wisdom. Poetic creation consists in letting the essential word be heard behind each word. The refrain sounds like surrender. It is actually a complete philosophical position, disguised as music. The theme Villon was working within has a long history. Ubi sunt qui ante nos in mundo fuere? Where are those who before us lived in the world? Runs through medieval literature from at least the 12th century, when the Cluniac monk Bernardus de Morlis wrote it into his vast poem of contempt for the world. Est ubi gloria nunc Babylonia? The theme crystallizes in the prolific and mediocre Eustache de Cham, and then in Jorge Manrique's great Spanish elegy for his dead father, and in William Dunbar's Scottish lament for the makers with its Latin refrain, Timor mortis conturbit me. These poets, Villon, Manrique, Dunbar, are contemporaries, and they constitute the three most complete expressions of their twilight epoch, of what has been called the autumn of the Middle Ages. They are unanimous in one feeling alone, which the least of them expressed with the greatest concision. The fear of death disturbs me. But what Villon did with his shared tradition was something none of the others did. Inside the medieval question, a new answer, or rather, a new refusal of the old answer. In the Middle Ages, those who asked, "Where are they?" knew the answer. They're in the other world, being rewarded or punished according to their virtues or sins. Memento mori, remember death, was a directive toward repentance, toward the preparation of the soul, toward the next world. But in Villon, the death is mort, a question mark, not a gateway, not a judgment, an uncertain light illuminating the human condition, without the certainty of what lies beyond. This, almost imperceptibly, is the first voice of the modern age speaking from inside the medieval tradition. He was, in every meaningful sense, a surprising man. He appeared in an era of the greatest artifice of a refined civilization, an era that Vincent de Beauvais had already summarized in his immense encyclopedia, an era where Aldous Huxley would have been quite at home, but François Villon, the plebeian at the margin of that society, expressed death, a word so present in the medieval imagination, in an entirely new way. For Villon, death is no longer the scourge of sin, no longer the door to paradise. It is a question mark, an unsettling light. And this new way of expressing the oldest of themes has an entirely new tone. Simple, direct, personal, stripped of the decorative apparatus of courtly convention, written in the actual language that people spoke. He spoke as men had always spoken and would always speak. There is nothing in him that is artificial. Not even the mixture of debauchery and brutality with the most humble devotion, like the tender Madonnas of a Memling, which is the symptom of the intimate tensions of a transitional era. His technical instruments are, paradoxically, completely traditional. The ballade form, the rondo, the scholastic structure of the Testament. The very vocabulary of his irreverence is saturated with the residues of his scholastic education. But what he does inside those traditional forms is to introduce himself, his actual self, degraded, frightened, tender, furious, devout, criminal, as the subject of the poem. And in doing so, he creates something that European poetry had not seen since the great lyric poets of Greece, whose works have been almost entirely lost. The individual voice speaking without mediation, without the consolation of a collective framework, alone with its condition. That condition was explicit. He knew he was facing the gallows. He knew his body, once dead, would hang and swing in the wind. Pousse si pousse là, comme le vent varie, now this way, now that, as the wind shifts. He addressed, from that knowledge, the human brothers who would come after, frères humains que après nous vivas, human brothers who live after us. And in the grand refrain, his petition for mercy, Je cry, à tous gens mercies, I cry to all people for mercy. The criminal whose heart was dark with earthly filth already saw the morning star begin to shine. From the lips of this condemned burst, like a hemorrhage, a chorus of golden stanzas asking forgiveness for everyone. Mais prise Dieu que tu nous voles sudra. His refrain is mort, death. It appears in every poem he left, in every form. The death of the body, the death of beautiful women, the death of his own youth at 30 years old, the death of the world he knew, the death he expected to die. Je connais la mort qui nous consomme. I know death that devours us all. And yet the poetry that circles this obsession is not pessimistic in any simple sense. It is something harder and stranger than pessimism. It is clear-eyed. It sees without flinching, and in seeing, finds, not consolation exactly, but something like the dignity of accurate witness. The man who knew everything except himself knew the human condition from the inside, from its darkest passages, and from that knowledge made art that has not aged. He asked, at the end, for mercy. Je crie à tous gens mercis. It was the cry of a man who had much to ask forgiveness for, and who, in the final paradox, found himself ready to forgive. His poetry is that act of forgiveness, extended across 6 centuries to the human brothers who live after him. We are those brothers, and the voice, coming from the gallows rope and the winter cold and the tavern and the prison and the violated church, is still, impossibly, the most natural voice in French literature. The most French, the most human, the most permanent. Frères humains qui après nous vivez, n'ayez les cœurs contre nous endurcis, car, ce pitié de nos pauvres avez, Dieu en aura plutôt de vous merci. Human brothers who live after us, do not harden your hearts against us. For if you have pity on us poor men, God will sooner have mercy on you. 6 centuries separate us from the man who wrote those lines. And the distance is nothing. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel. The sources used are in the description. And see you next time with another human story.